Thank you so much, Simon and Pam. That was beautiful, wasn't it? Amazing. To have that stunning interpretation of tonight's subject, the subject of this seminar, Vaughan Williams, is a true gift to those of us who are excited to learn more about this incredible composer. So good afternoon, and welcome to Grace and St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. Welcome especially to the 2022 Robert D. McJimsey Seminar, one of the treasured annual, except when interrupted by global pandemics, traditions of this parish. This series is a valued partnership with Colorado College. And am happy to tell you that Dr. Saylor will be speaking there tomorrow at Colorado College at noon. And the title of that talk is called The Composer in Wartime, Vaughan Williams' Music of Conflict. And so you'll have an opportunity to hear another talk by Dr. Saylor tomorrow. And I think you're going to want to go to that after hearing him speak tonight. Dr. Saylor will also be speaking tomorrow at UCCS at 4:30. And the title of that talk is The Past We Choose to Remember, Reflections on the Academic Music Anthology. And so you have the opportunity to collect the entire set. If you, 3 lectures that Dr. Saylor is going to be offering today and tomorrow. He's going to be a busy man. I want to thank all of you for being here today and joining us for what I know is going to be an excellent and illuminating event. We are very pleased this year to welcome as our distinguished speaker, Dr. Eric Saylor. Dr. Saylor is a professor of music history at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa. He received a bachelor's degree in violin performance from Drake, an MA in musicology from Arizona State, and a PhD in musicology from the University of Michigan. Dr. Saylor's area of specialization is British art music of the 19th and 20th centuries, focusing particularly on the life and works of Vaughan Williams and on pastoralism in music. His most recent book is a biography entitled Vaughan Williams. It was published by Oxford University Press just this year. And I hear it's selling well. So get it on your wish list. He is also the author of the book English Pastoral Music from Arcadia to Utopia, 1900 to 1955. In addition, he has written numerous articles and reviews for a variety of respected journals and publications. Dr. Saylor has received several grants and awards, including the Outstanding Teacher of the Year Award from Drake's College of Arts and Sciences, the Drake Humanities Research Scholar Award, and a Visiting Research Fellowship from Merton College, Oxford. He also served as president of the North American British Music Studies Association from 2016 to 2020. Perhaps most notably, Dr. Saylor has received from his students the top tags, amazing lectures, and hilarious on the website Rate My Professor. Dr. Saylor and his spouse Amy are the parents of 2 high school band students, Lee, who plays trumpet, and Tamsin, who plays the tuba. As a family, they cheer on, I'm sure, in good and bad times, the Chicago Cubs. And I believe it is worth noting, since we are here at Grace and St. Stephen's, that Dr. Saylor is married to Rebecca Theobald's cousin. Today's lecture is entitled The Letter and the Spirit, the Religious and Visionary Music of Ralph Vaughan Williams. You know, a subject really comes alive when the speaker speaks from a place of love. And so I think you're really going to enjoy this. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Saylor.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for coming out today to go ahead and hear me present. It's lovely to go ahead and be here in Colorado where there's actual things in the way of the sky, unlike at home, which is really lovely, and to have all of you to share this with today. There are several people I'd like to thank before beginning today's talk. I'd like to extend my great appreciation to Professor Carol Neal and to Mariana McJimsey for inviting me out here to do this presentation, which I'm very flattered and honored to be asked to go ahead and do. Thecla Schubert at Colorado College, who has provided a huge amount of administrative assistance for this. Simon Jacobs and Pam Chadden for providing the opening performance of the 6 Studies in English Folk Song by Vaughan Williams for you, which was a wonderful way, I think, to go ahead and start us off. And to the whole extended Theobald clan for all of their work in what they've been doing, particularly to Chuck, who is behind the scenes right now, manning all of the electronics and sound things and stuff, so don't distract him. And of course, to Margaret, who is helping at the computer today, so thanks to all of them for being here. Now, one thing I realized in putting this talk together was when I do these sorts of talks, oftentimes they're in conjunction with things like concerts or other kinds of situations where the audience is already at least moderately or vaguely familiar with the person in question. I forgot, however, that this is not really the circumstance for these kinds of lectures. So if you'll indulge me, you may be wondering, who is this Ralph Vaughan Williams guy, and why is everybody pronouncing his name incorrectly based on what we can see up there? So if you'll indulge, I can give you a 2-minute thumbnail of who this gentleman is that we're talking about. First off, the name, just for clarification purposes. The man's last name is in fact Vaughan Williams. It's a double-barreled last name, just no hyphen. And his first name looks like Ralph. It's pronounced Rafe, like the actor Ralph Fiennes. It's just a variant on the name. Dates back to about the 17th century or so in England. That's often used a little bit more, either by upper middle class people or people from the north. He falls into the former category. If you're wondering why we should be interested in Vaughan Williams, of course, the fact that some music was playing at the outset might be the clue, because he is, of course, one of the great composers of the 20th century. In addition to composing music, however, he's involved in many other fields with it as well. He is a conductor, and a teacher, and an author, and a lecturer, and a folklorist, and an administrator, and a philanthropist. And in fact, it's probably fair to say that almost no single individual has had more impact on the shape and direction of music in the country of England during the 20th century than Ralph Vaughan Williams. He was born in 1872 in the tiny Gloucestershire village of Down Amney, and died in 1958 at the age of 85, living in London at the time. In between then, he had quite a full career. He went to school at the Royal College of Music in London and Cambridge University. And one of the things that endears him to me is the fact that he was not a child prodigy. When you're a professional historian like I am, you get really annoyed with all of these people who are very good at the age of 5 or what have you. You know, you'll hear about Mozart touring Europe at the age of 8, or somebody else who writes their first opera when they're 5, or another one who pops out of the womb with 2 piano concertos and a symphony already done. It's tedious. You don't like that. Vaughan Williams was not like that at all. He had to work very, very hard to go ahead and figure out his own artistic voice, and drew upon a tremendous number of different influences around him at the time. He was inspired by the romantic masters of his age that he studied when he was at university, including people like Johannes Brahms and Richard Wagner. He was interested tremendously in English folk music, he was not only a studier of it, he also collected it. He was an extraordinarily important person in its preservation and dissemination, collecting over 800 English folk songs over the course of his own lifetime. He was also terribly interested in English ecclesiastical music, from the great Tudor masters of the 16th and 17th centuries, all the way up through hymnidists from all throughout the nation's history. He was also interested in contemporary French music of the likes of Debussy and Ravel, as well as many other traditions that come into his ken over the years. And from that, he found his own distinctive idiom that he was able to practice over the course of a 60-year-long career. And he contributed to every major genre in art music that there was. He composed 9 symphonies, 6 operas, 4 concerti, and a huge host of liturgical music and choral works and songs and chamber works and so many other things over the course of a lifetime, written for the greatest soloists and the most prestigious ensembles in the world to the humblest amateur orchestras and church choirs throughout his own country. Again, it's fair to say that no single individual probably had a greater impact on shaping English music in the 20th century than Vaughan Williams. And I have been very grateful being able to make a career out of looking at his music. So today, I'm going to be sharing with you the subject of today's talk, the letter and the spirit, one particular facet of his work, the religious and visionary music of Ralph Vaughan Williams. So in April of 1920, just a little more than a year after Vaughan Williams was demobilized from active service in the Great War, the journal Music and Letters published a meditative essay of his called The Letter and the Spirit. After introducing the ostensible premise, that is that reading a score and listening to a score are not equivalent actions, Vaughan Williams made a somewhat striking assertion. Before going any further, may we take it that the object of an art is to obtain a partial revelation of that which is beyond human senses and human faculties, of that, in fact, which is spiritual, and that the means we employ to induce this revelation are those very senses and faculties themselves. The human, visible, audible, and intelligible media which artists of all kinds use are symbols not of other visible and audible things, but of what lies beyond sense and knowledge. He continues, certain types of musical thinkers seem to have inherited the medieval fear of beauty. They talk about mere beauty and mere sound as if they were something to be feared and avoided. But in our imperfect existence, what means have we of reaching out to that which is beyond the senses, but through those very senses? Surely, while music is the art of sound, it is the ear which must be taught its language. Now, these are remarkable statements for a serious composer to make in 1920. One doesn't have to be a hardline modernist to question post-war claims of beauty as a self-evident virtue, or spiritual enrichment as a measure of artistic value. Indeed, many artists, composers, poets, dramatists, and writers found the pillars of their faith shaken after the war, whether their foundations were set in religious conviction, humanist philosophy, or a belief in art's ability to transform individuals. Creative turns towards objectivity, abstraction, irony, and pessimism, often expressing righteous anger or bitter despair, reflected the existential crisis of the age, and were often treated as markers of serious art. After all, what possible value could romantically tinged scenes and sentiments hold for a world that had witnessed the excruciating birth of modernity on the killing fields of France? What loving God, what creative impulse could redeem such nihilistic destruction, such evidence of man's inherent inhumanity? Now, it's on this rather downbeat note that I'd like to begin today's exploration of Vaughan Williams's idiosyncratic and indeed iconoclastic conception of spirituality and belief. The very fact that he, a veteran who saw active combat on both the eastern and western fronts of the Great War, could nevertheless unironically invoke music's intangible power to enrich the senses and elevate the spirit, suggests that he possessed a visionary understanding of belief that transcended narrow dogmas and heavy-handed moralizing, and as such, was capable of withstanding the crises of faith that gripped so many in the post-war world. His philosophy comprised many elements: sacred and secular, ancient and modern, real and imaginary, and its influence can be heard and seen in some of the most significant and beloved works in his catalog. To that end, I'll examine some of the writers and texts that informed his approach to sacred music, including allegorical novelist John Bunyan, poets George Herbert and Walt Whitman, and the King James Version of the Bible, also known in England as the Authorized Version, and the range of responses that they inspired. Now we can begin with a categorical, if perhaps surprising statement. Despite his many contributions to Anglican hymnody and Christian liturgical music, as well as his lifelong employment of sacred and scriptural texts, Vaughan Williams was not a practicing Christian. Stories about his religious indifference while a student at Cambridge, there he is, handsome lad that he was, are well known, skipping chapel prayers at Trinity College, disrupting Hall by announcing, "Who believes in God nowadays, I should like to know," or foregoing communion at the Church of St. Barnabas in South London, where he was employed for a few years in the 1890s as an organist and a choir director, and regularly passed time in the organ loft reading French novels. And lest we think that this was merely a youthful, rebellious phase, after all, surely the man who would later serve as the musical editor for the English hymnal and songs of praise must have mellowed in later years, later statements prove otherwise. Vaughan Williams gently but firmly refused to become godfather to the son of his good friend Martin Shaw in 1920, citing his unease to take an active part in a ceremony I don't believe in and to solemnly promise a lot of things I have no intention of doing. In 1931, he turned down the honor of a Lambeth Doctorate in Music, offered in recognition of his many contributions to sacred music. Writing to Frederick Dwelly, the Dean of Liverpool Cathedral, who had extended the award on behalf of the Archbishop of Canterbury, Vaughan Williams said that while he appreciated very much the proposed honor, he felt such things are really not for me, as he no longer counted himself a member of the Church of England. And yet, Vaughan Williams was a humanist who respected the Church's emphasis on beauty as a means of enriching the spirit, while the ritual and tradition embodied in the Latin text of the Mass would have appealed to his aesthetic sensibilities, particularly in the early part of his career. Many of his compositions, written between the late 1890s and mid-1900s, employ texts from pre-Raphaelite poets like Christina Rossetti and her brother, Dante Gabriel, which embrace the same kind of mannered tone and ritualized design common in many texts associated with the Christian Church. This may explain why he turned to the words of the Christian Mass in order to fulfill his composition requirement for the doctorate in music at Cambridge, resulting in the work that would later become known as a Cambridge Mass. Vaughan Williams revealed his textual choice to his cousin Ralph Wedgwood in June 1899, asserting, "They're such fine words, and you get such good climaxes out of them." There was no reason, as he later argued about his Mass in G minor of 1922, why an atheist could not write a good Mass, or at least, in 1899, one that was capable of satisfying the members of Cambridge's Music Exam Board. But while Vaughan Williams may not have been religious himself, he took its practice very seriously. He understood that by engaging in the mystery and the beauty of ancient ritual, individuals could transcend the mundanities of daily life, much as he did when composing. In 2008, commemorating the 50th anniversary of the composer's death, Archbishop of Canterbury Rowan Williams praised this attitude. He wanted to do justice to the humanity gathered in a church or a cathedral, even if he wasn't very sure about the divinity. He wanted to recognize that to worship in a church is to enter a larger world, to inhabit a mysterious, challenging, and almost unbelievably exhilarating as well as sobering environment, from which you emerge with a sense of yourself and your environment transfigured. That is what he believed church ought to be like. In other words, he had higher expectations and higher hopes of church worship than a great many cheerful or not so cheerful believers. He knew that it mattered for human beings to accept the invitation to celebrate, to be joyful, and to be transfigured by beauty. And Vaughan Williams was more than willing to act on those expectations, calling out sacred practices or traditions that he felt didn't live up to his standard, such as the hymn book Hymns Ancient and Modern, published in 1861. To put it simply, Vaughan Williams was not an admirer. In a lecture first given in 1902, he allowed, somewhat backhandedly, that the original intention of the compilers of these hymns was not wholly bad, but believed that they had capitulated to popular taste at the expense of musical and even moral quality. He castigated the editor's proclivity for exotic and languorous tunes, which could be nothing but enervating to those who sang and heard them. And in later editions, the element of maudlin sentiment has grown alarmingly, until at last the bad has almost driven out the good. National music should represent the people. Will anyone dare to say that the effusions of the Joseph Barnby School represent the English people? Hardworking men and women should be given bracing and stimulating music, not the unhealthy outcome of theatrical sentiment. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, if we're being fair, but opinions like this may explain why, in late 1904, he was approached by Percy Dearmer, the socialist and reformist vicar of St. Mary's, Primrose Hill, London, to serve as the musical editor for the English Hymnal, a collection meant to supplant hymns ancient and modern. And while it took time away from composing, he admitted that 2 years of close association with some of the best, as well as some of the worst, tunes in the world was a better musical education than any amount of sonatas and fugues. In the case of the English Hymnal, Vaughan Williams expanded the stylistic, geographic, and temporal range of the music on offer. He was unable to eliminate all of the tunes he disliked, as the music committee felt several were too popular to remove. So as a compromise, the worst offenders were confined in an appendix at the end of the book, which we nicknamed the Chamber of Horrors. He replaced the melodies he cut with tunes from British and Continental Psalters, with sacred compositions by Tudor and Restoration-era composers such as Thomas Tallis, Orlando Gibbons, and Henry Purcell. New hymns commissioned from British composers, including Gustav Holst, Nicholas Gaddy, Thomas Dunhill, W.H. Bell, and himself, writing as Mr. Anan. Songs of foreign provenance from Germany, France, Italy, Holland, Spain, and even the United States. And perhaps most significantly, arrangements or adaptations of folk songs. The result was an imaginative and stylistically varied compilation that, by the 1920s, had largely overshadowed hymns ancient and modern. Later that decade, he undertook editing duties with Martin Shaw on a second hymn book with a slightly more populist aim, Songs of Praise. According to Shaw, Vaughan Williams insisted on certain criteria for the collection. First, that warm words should be married to an austere tune, and vice versa, in order to maintain the dignity necessary to public utterance as opposed to private, and to combine that with humanity. Secondly, the finest version of every tune, and not necessarily the earliest, should be the one printed. Thirdly, that fine melody, rather than the exploitation of a trained choir, should govern selection. This balance between accessibility, attractiveness, and spiritual aspiration guided Vaughan Williams's compositional approach when writing sacred music, and reflected deep respect for its performers' spiritual desires and their musical skills, whether amateur or professional. This approach carried over into other spheres of composition as well. Now, so far, I've considered only liturgical works, that is, those meant to be performed as part of a worship service. But Vaughan Williams also regularly set sacred texts in non-liturgical works, such as his oratorio Sancta Civitas, the cantata Dona Nobis Pacem, and the Fantasia on the Old 104th for piano, chorus, and orchestra. And he wrote compositions that featured religious but non-scriptural texts, like the 5 mystical songs for baritone, chorus, and orchestra, or his many settings of John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress. He was also drawn to literary and artistic sources with metaphysical or mystical undertones, sometimes rooted in religion, sometimes not, by poets like Walt Whitman, George Meredith, and William Blake, among others. Such engagement continued throughout his career and in a wide variety of genres, including songs, cantatas, masques, chamber music, operas, and orchestral literature, indicating the significant place these concepts held in his creative worldview. However, in addition to his own personal preferences when it came to such texts, Vaughan Williams also had to contend with the realities of British musical life, particularly around the turn of the 20th century. For while we today may recognize a whole host of British artists from that era as outstanding contributors to the broader world of art music, including figures like Edward Elgar, Ethel Smythe, Frederick Delius, John Ireland, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, Gustav Holst, and Vaughan Williams himself, the prospects for a career in music around 1900 were still fairly limited. To be sure, they were better than they had been even a generation earlier, when respectable careers for aspiring British composers or performers were largely limited to those associated with academia or the church. Music making as a career was still frequently associated with dilettantes or foreigners, and treated as incompatible with social respectability. But, thanks to a variety of forms and pioneering efforts by dedicated artists, educators, critics, intellectuals, and patrons, these circumstances began to change over the last quarter of the 19th century, laying the conditions for composers like Vaughan Williams to attain success not only in Britain, but internationally. All of this is by way of saying that Vaughan Williams came of age during a time of flux in artistic tastes and conventions in Britain, and he was as much a product of and subject to his own Victorian upbringing as any of his contemporaries. So I can give you just one example. While it's perhaps his symphonic works that received the greatest critical approbation within his body of work today, they were not the sorts of compositions that would have been suitable for the performing opportunities available to him as a young man in the 1890s. Solo and part songs, small-scale orchestral pieces like his Serenade of 1901 or the Bucolic Suite of 1902, and choral works would have been the most plausible genres to which composers could contribute, the last in no small part because of the prominent place that choral festivals enjoyed and still do in British culture. These annual events, often programmed over several days, typically brought together amateur and professional musicians, and especially in northern cities and smaller provincial towns, represented artistic highlights for the host community. The Leeds Festival and the Three Choirs Festival, which rotates triennially among the cathedrals of Gloucester, Hereford, and Worcester, represent two of the most prominent examples of such events. And Vaughan Williams himself served as the conductor for the Leith Hill Festival. You can see an action shot of him there right up front at the podium. It was founded in 1905 by his older sister, Meggie, and their mutual friend, Evangeline Ferrer, and he served in this capacity as its music director for almost 50 years. Large-scale choral works like Handel's Messiah or Mendelssohn's Elijah were common fare at these events, and Edward Elgar's early reputation was largely built on his success at such festivals with choral orchestral works featuring texts from scripture, British history, or Anglophone literature, and importantly, not just English literature. For Vaughan Williams's earliest major success in this field came with Toward the Unknown Region, which had its debut at the 1907 Leeds Festival. The text is by Walt Whitman and reflects the fascination that the good great poet's verses had on Vaughan Williams's generation, particularly within the leftist and socially progressive subcultures of English society to which Vaughan Williams most definitely belonged. Whitman's poetry was admired by intellectuals and the general public alike. Moreover, their length and metrical unpredictability, so scandalous only a few decades before, suggested novel rhythmic effects when set to music, a trait that many composers also exploited when setting passages from the King James Version of the Bible. A brief aside here, Vaughan Williams's general indifference toward the practice of religion didn't preclude his deep admiration for the literary qualities of the KJV. He drew upon its verses throughout his career in contexts ranging from liturgical motets to ceremonial music to large-scale choral orchestral works, a clear reflection of his admiration for what he described as the text's incomparable beauty. As far as Whitman was concerned, however, Vaughan Williams returned to his poetry off and on over the better part of 30 years. Late in his life, he told his biographer, Michael Kennedy, that unlike some of his earlier literary enthusiasms, he'd never gone off Whitman. While Whitman's poetic output, like the man himself, was large and contained multitudes, Vaughan Williams was most attracted to those passages that celebrated democracy, brotherhood, and spiritual transcendence. He undoubtedly saw in Whitman's ability to throw off centuries of literary models to create his own distinctive and idiosyncratic language, an approach that paralleled his own musical goals. But he also realized that Whitman's texts provided a viable alternative to the overt expressions of Christian faith that had long dominated the programs of British choral orchestral festivals. In the case of Toward the Unknown Region, which extracted lines from Whispers of Heavenly Death, the result was, in the words of Roger Savage, a kind of liberal humanist purgatorio and paradiso for the progress of the soul in death. Similarly, transcendent visions of universal brotherhood and international cooperation undergird the foundations of Vaughan Williams's mighty choral orchestral Sea Symphony of 1910, even in the face of the Anglo-German naval arms race underway during its composition, and with the awareness of the implicit threat that Germany posed to British sea power at the time. All these visions are ultimately optimistic ones, professing hope for a better world, if not now, then in a time or place yet to come. This is a key tenet of Vaughan Williams's artistic philosophy, thrown into particularly sharp relief when one considers the textual layout of the cantata Dona Nobis Pacem, Grant Us Peace, written for the 100th anniversary of the Huddersfield Choral Festival in 1936. Commentators, myself very much included, tend to focus on the way that the amalgamation of biblical texts in the final section tempers this almost unrelentingly grim piece with expressions of hope. Nation shall not lift up a sword against nation. Mercy and truth are met. The nations are gathered together, and on earth there is peace and goodwill. But the first three movements feature extended texts from Whitman's drum taps. The first and third movements, Beat, Beat, Drums, and the Dirge for Two Veterans, are grounded very much in reality. The former evoking the inescapable chaos of total warfare, and the latter, its aftermath, as seen in a funeral procession for a father and son killed in battle together. Between them is Whitman's comparatively brief and almost indescribably moving reconciliation, the opening stanza of which envisions hope within the wreckage.
To the hands of the sisters, death and the night incessantly, softly wash again and ever again.
This expression of redemption through loss was one that Vaughan Williams returned to over and over throughout his career, particularly in his dramatic works, but rarely with the concision and the poignance achieved here. It's a powerful declaration of faith, but not one made to any god, rather to a profound, perhaps irrational belief in humanity's potential to grow and learn and make a better world. I'll return to this idea a little bit later on, but it's worth pointing out here that such sentiments are not merely naive utopian fantasies conjured within the artist's ivory tower. Whitman and Vaughan Williams were veterans themselves, both of whom tended to the injured and the dying in the course of their duties, and they understand the inhumanity of war better than most. Yet they chose to fight the nihilism and existential despair that follows in war's wake, envisioning instead a better world that could emerge from the destruction of the old. Now, such sentiments are not easily conveyed, and it must be said, do not particularly satisfy those of faith who seek to understand the reasons why such things happen. God moves in mysterious ways, we're told, and God's reasons are not ours to understand, a subject that Vaughan Williams addressed at some length in his so-called Mask for Dancing, Job, of 1930, which was inspired by William Blake's visionary illustrations from the book of Job, and in which our titular subject runs aground when trying to grasp the reasons for God's behavior. Yet explanations that seek to justify suffering by covering them with the rhetorical cloaks of a greater plan or divine incomprehensibility are similarly inadequate, as they deny us either comfort or enlightenment, however bitter it may be. So, what options are left for those who seek to better grapple with such challenges? Well, for Vaughan Williams, the answer was clear. One must turn to art. In 1954, as part of his acceptance speech and receipt of Yale University's Henry Elias Howland Prize, he defined art as the means by which one man communicates spiritually with another. Now, what precisely he meant by this, he didn't say, but a close reading of his comments on this subject over many years offers some prospective answers. Broadly speaking, Vaughan Williams believed that individuals have unique ways of understanding the world and their places within it. As far as he's concerned, one's national culture shaped that perception more than any other factor. But even that common factor will manifest in myriad ways, depending on an individual's experiences. Art is one way of conveying that viewpoint. And anyone involved in the making of music, from the virtuoso professional to the last chair second violin in the middle school orchestra, expresses in their own way what he called that vision of the ultimate realities. Performers, of course, often do this by recreating the works of other artists, but composers must figure out a way to render their vision comprehensible, and even then, the resulting effects vary enormously. This may be one reason why Vaughan Williams was notoriously reluctant to speak about the meaning of his own works, because he didn't want to deny listeners the experience of undertaking their own spiritual journey by locking them into a fixed interpretation of what his works really meant. However, one way in which composers may help guide listeners to a greater understanding of their vision is through the setting of text. I've already noted various ways in which Vaughan Williams does this, but it's worth considering how he approaches texts written from a perspective he does not share, at least in a strictly literal sense, and what it reveals about his understanding of the nature of spirituality. Let's take, for instance, the poetry of George Herbert, Anglican cleric and metaphysical poet, born in 1593 and dying in 1633. By a neat coincidence, Herbert's parish in Bemerton, Salisbury, was in fact exactly the same one that Vaughan Williams' father, Arthur, was first appointed to upon being ordained as a deacon in 1860. Now, during his own time, Herbert was celebrated for the way in which the simplicity of his verse was turned to revelatory ends, distilling complex spiritual topics into unpretentious and accessible language. In 1911, Vaughan Williams wrote a collection called 5 Mystical Songs, and this showcases Herbert's poetry. And the composer's approach to it suggests a pair of divergent interpretive possibilities. In songs like Love Bade Me Welcome and The Call, it's clear that the subject of Herbert's focus is God, whether metaphorically in the former in the guise of love, or in the latter as invoked in The Call's litany of addresses: my way, my truth, my life, my light, my feast, my strength, my joy, my love, my heart.
Strength, such a light as shows a
And yet, it is equally possible, as it certainly seems to me to be Vaughan Williams's aim here, to imagine such lines alluding to or being addressed to one's beloved here on earth. A transformation of meaning at odds with Herbert's intentions, but nonetheless reflecting Vaughan Williams's own conception of boundless and all-encompassing love. Now, to be clear, this was nothing new. Vaughan Williams felt entirely free to modify any text he set to music, regardless of whether or not it maintained fidelity to the original, so long as it served his purposes. At the same time, however, his settings of overtly religious texts like Herbert's Easter, I Got Me Flowers, and the closing antiphon absolutely commit to the poem's expressions of Christian devotion. This reveals the composer's empathy, his willingness to recognize and respect conceits that fall outside his own personal preferences, so long as he can understand and appreciate the artistry that motivated their creation. This is one of the driving factors behind his work on the English hymnal, and later in his annual performances of J.S. Bach's St. Matthew and St. John Passion in the Surrey village of Dorking. It's worth lingering here briefly to consider the significance of Bach's influence on Vaughan Williams because it was immense. Vaughan Williams admired Bach above all other composers, whether for his meticulous craftsmanship, his sense of social responsibility, albeit in a rather different context than we would understand it today, or, as he put it, the intense humanity which endears him to me and my fellow bourgeois. He wrote and spoke about Bach's life and music on multiple occasions throughout his career, regularly directed performances of his pieces, and often drew inspiration from Bach's works in creating his own, from hymn tunes to elaborate contrapuntal keyboard works to large-scale symphonic and choral pieces. And one quality that he emphasized in discussing Bach was what he saw as the endurance of Bach's creative vision, which was, of course, anchored in his devout Lutheran faith. Yet interestingly, and somewhat controversially, Vaughan Williams took it upon himself to adjust Bach's music under certain circumstances, such as substituting piano for harpsichord. He hated the harpsichord with the burning, white-hot passion of 1,000 suns. He described it as reminding him of the sound of nothing more than a broken sewing machine. He would also introduce orchestral doublings or substitutions that Bach didn't authorize, or make small musical modifications to suit the translations of texts from German to English. And to a certain degree, his justifications for doing so align with his broader understanding of faith. As he wrote in Bach, the Great Bourgeois, "If we adhere meticulously and mechanically to the letter of Bach, we shall inevitably kill the spirit." Bach's hearers were 18th century German Lutherans with minds very different from ours. Why should we perform Bach with all the disabilities under which he suffered any more than we perform Shakespeare in the Elizabethan pronunciation? If by modifying the letter we kill the spirit of Bach, then he had better remain dead and be put in the museum with the other mummies. Through all the changes and chances, the beauty of his music abides because his music appeals to everyone, not only to the aesthete, the musicologist, or the propagandist, but above all, to Whitman's divine average, that great middle class from whom nearly all that is worthwhile in religion, painting, poetry, and music has sprung. And it was that engagement with the mystical within the bounds of everyday experience that elevates Bach's music, and which Vaughan Williams strove to replicate in his own. Now, if Bach's compositions acted as one of the most powerful goads to Vaughan Williams's musical imagination, then its literary counterpart was undoubtedly John Bunyan's The Pilgrim's Progress of 1678. Now, the reasons for Vaughan Williams's fascination with Bunyan's allegorical novel are not very intuitive. After all, one would hardly expect that a wealthy, educated non-believer of the 20th century would find a lot of common ground with a working-class, unschooled evangelical Puritan of the 17th. And yet, Vaughan Williams returned to Bunyan's writing for nearly half a century, setting it in a variety of forms. Dramatic scenes for amateur players featuring sung passages, incidental music in 1906. The so-called pastoral episode, The Shepherds of the Delectable Mountains of 1922, a one-act chamber opera. Incidental music for a 1943 BBC radio play. and a full-length opera, or Morality, as he called it, from 1951. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with the story, it follows the Christian, a pilgrim from the city of destruction on his quest to attain salvation in the celestial city. He's helped along by the evangelist, the residents of the House Beautiful, and fellow pilgrims hopeful and faithful, while overcoming obstacles such as the Slough of Despond, Giant Despair, Apollyon in the Valley of Humiliation, that's him there, and the temptations of Vanity Fair. While these settings and characters are sharply defined, the allegorical nature of the story means that their behavior is not especially naturalistic, and the tone, unsurprisingly, leans toward the stridently moralizing. Again, Vaughan Williams had no compunction about cutting, editing, and reorganizing Bunyan's text or anyone else's, but one change particularly stands out because of the insight it gives into his conception of Bunyan's work. In an oft-quoted letter to his colleague and fellow composer, Rutland Boughton, Vaughan Williams explained why he changed the protagonist's name from Christian to Pilgrim. I, on purpose, did not call the pilgrim Christian because I want the work to be universal and apply to anybody who aims at the spiritual life, whether he's Christian, Jew, Buddhist, Shintoist, or Fifth-day Adventist. Vaughan Williams also knew his Bunyan well enough to recall that Christian was, in fact, a name adopted by the character himself. At the House Beautiful, when Watchful the porter asks his name, Christian responds, "My name is now Christian, but my name at first was Graceless. I came of the race of Japheth, whom God will persuade to dwell in the tents of Shem," a passage that Vaughan Williams had actively marked in his own copy of the book. Vaughan Williams' change not only stays true to Bunyan's broader ideological concept, but it arguably strengthens the story's dramatic rationale. It is Graceless's despairing cry, "What shall I do to be saved?" that attracts the attention of the evangelist, who then sends him on his journey. Even Bunyan doesn't refer to Christian by anything other than a pronoun until the character has decided to follow the evangelist's instructions. If he'd been capable of living up to his Christian name from the outset, the pilgrimage wouldn't have been necessary in the first place. Pilgrim, therefore, is a more appropriate designation for a lost soul seeking the road to salvation and enlightenment, as Christian suggests that one might already have had a map and compass available. Vaughan Williams's ostensible claim for greater universality takes on a slightly different tone when we consider that it's only in his settings of the story written after the Great War that this name change takes place, beginning with the Shepherds of the Delectable Mountains. Now, the 2019 performance of The Pilgrim's Progress, the 1951 version, by the Royal Northern College of Music in Manchester, plays up these associations pretty clearly, as the set's frequent evocation of landscape paintings by British war artist Paul Nash, I think makes pretty evident. Clearly, Vaughan Williams felt that the basic concept undergirding Bunyan's allegory, a lost soul's quest for a utopian paradise where he can be absolved of his sins, was still relevant to 20th century audiences, despite its fundamentalist origins and heavy-handed Christian imagery. And although Vaughan Williams' interest in the Pilgrim's Progress predated his military service, it seems significant that he returned to it almost immediately upon re-entering civilian life. The desire for spiritual redemption and renewal formed a bleak backdrop to British life after the Great War. The desire to invest the war with meaning consumed contemporary thought to an extent almost unparalleled since the English Civil Wars, the last great threat to the country's existence. Coincidentally, Bunyan himself knew of such fears, for he too was a veteran, having fought for the parliamentarians as a teenager and faced a similarly unsettled social and political world upon the establishment of the Commonwealth. So it's tempting, given this knowledge, to see Pilgrim's reluctance to cross the river of death in the celestial city at the end of the story, paralleling similar disquiet felt by many soldiers upon returning home, the utopian haven so deeply longed for in the midst of war, being so often unable to live up to their desires or to entirely counterbalance their dystopian battlefield experiences. In the wake of the First World War, Vaughan Williams' faith in humanity, profoundly shaken by the conflict, was in need of buttressing. He faced a crisis that was both existential and spiritual. Either forge a new mode of musical expression that would be creatively honest and culturally meaningful, or begin a slow but inexorable descent into artistic irrelevance. To use the psychic wreckage of the war as the foundation for that musical path required plumbing spiritual and personal depths that most people would rather leave unexplored. No one, Vaughan Williams least of all, could have expected that the musical idiom he found there would have such a wide-reaching impact, firmly asserting that beauty was still possible, still spiritually meaningful, still necessary for a world steeped in tragedy and loss. I can think of no better way to demonstrate that than by listening to Vaughan Williams's own audiation of the celestial city itself, as heard in the penultimate scene of the Pilgrim's Progress. Just to set the scene for you here, at the very beginning of this, or excuse me, just before this clip begins, Pilgrim has gone under the waters of the River of Death, the final obstacle between him and the celestial city. And all you hear is the quiet sound of the timpani. And then, from the city, the call of trumpets and the choir of the beautiful shining ones singing alleluias, which gradually grow as he is welcomed to the city until they are interspersed with the noble hymn tune York that blasts out in full brass with the choir, an absolutely stunning and beautiful rendition. Those of you who also are familiar with Vaughan Williams's Fantasia on a Theme by Thomas Tallis may also hear a passage from that particular hymn tune invoked quite frequently throughout this particular clip. In taking this artistic position, Vaughan Williams was not retreating from modernity, nor clinging to the past. He was, in fact, that rarest of things in post-war Britain, an idealist. Not because naivete or privilege shielded him from reality, but because he was a person who, when confronted with the injustices, inequities, and shortcomings of the world, saw their opposition as a moral responsibility. Is the world ugly? Then it must be made beautiful. Do the people despair? Then they must remember hope. Does the spirit suffer? Then it must be made glad. While he never made such statements in as many words, the creative direction and thematic content of his post-war music, and indeed his idiosyncratic engagement with sacred and visionary texts over the course of his entire career, strongly implies such concerns were at the forefront of his thinking. Such challenges could only be taken up by someone embodying unique combinations of inherited privilege and unselfish service, intellectual refinement and intuitive vision, social prestige and professional respect. To a degree matched by few other artists of his generation, Vaughan Williams had both the desire to accept such a burden and the heart to bear it. And yet it is we today who reap the benefit of his commanding and deeply spiritual ability to let us share his glimpses of that which is beyond human senses and human faculties. Thank you. Thank you very much. I am told that there is time, if you would like, before sherry and snacks, for me to answer any questions, if anybody has any that would like to go ahead and raise at the time. Meg, you got someone back there, I think? We'll have someone come back with a microphone for you. Nope.
Is this on?
It is.
So I was curious that how much of the work that he did was just for churches and liturgy, and how much were really just inspired by his own vision?
A lot of it is done for churches. I mean, the English hymnal, for instance, was something he was commissioned to do, and it took him 2 years of work to go ahead and do. He really didn't make terribly much money off of doing it. In fact, he said he spent 250 pounds of his own money over the course of putting the thing together. But there were other events that he was given free rein, for instance, to go ahead and choose what he wanted to do for it. So when he set Dona Nobis Pacem in 1936 for the Huddersfield Choral Festival, they just gave him carte blanche, said, do what you like. And so he selected that combination of texts from the authorized version and combined them with Whitman. Similarly, he did the same thing with Sancta Civitas, which was done for the 250th anniversary of the opening of the Sheldonian Theatre at Oxford. There's other ones where he is asked for a particular celebration at a church. Would you mind writing a new set of services or a Magnificat for us? Sure, be happy to go ahead and do that. Or if a particular choral festival was sponsored by a church and there were test pieces for it, would you make sure that one of these is taking a liturgical text? Absolutely. So it's not quite 50-50, but it's pretty even-handed over the course of his career. It just depends on whether or not the commissioning body decides they really need to have something specific for the time, or if he feels like it would do the job for what he wants to do, what he's feeling and considering and thinking about at the time. Any other questions? I understand we want to get to snacks, so that's fine if we'd like to. Well, then thank you very much for being here today, and please feel free to go ahead and chat when we get into the reception, and I look forward to seeing you all there. Thank you again so much for having me as part of the McJimsey Seminar. I so appreciate it, and thank you all for being here.